So we have arrived at the 1st of April 1993 with the Department of Health establishing the National Blood Authority. It established a special health authority called the National Blood Authority. We've looked at the recommendations of the working group, and the NBA's role was to monitor the operation of the regional transfusion centres and to provide advice as to the coordination of their respective activities. Shortly after the National Blood Authority was established, the order establishing it was significantly amended. So from the 1st of April 1994, so a year into its existence, the NBA took over direct responsibility for the collection, screening and processing of blood and its constituents and supply of blood and blood products for the NHS. So there was a hybrid position, if you like, of a year between the 1st of April 93 and the 1st of April 94, where you had the NBA in existence with the regional transfusion centres operating through the regional health authorities. But that came to an end on the 1st of April 1994. And probably the easiest place to understand how that looks is to look at the presentation, which is INQY 40307 at page 28. Because what we've done there is set out the functions of the NBA at paragraph 87. So the initial functions, if we can go down to the bullet points, the initial functions that were contained within the 1993 that were exercised by the NBA in 1993, with the provision of laboratories for the manufacture of blood products for therapeutic, diagnostic and other purposes, research and development in plasma protein fractionation for other purposes, manufacture of blood grouping reagents and other related reagents, the supply of blood products prepared or manufactured under subparagraph B, which is actually preparation of plasma fractions, for the purpose of the health service. And then if we go down to the footnote, we can see that in addition, it had paragraph F, the monitoring of the operation by regional health authorities of the transfusion service and the provision of advice to the Secretary of State in connection with that service. And G, the provision of advice to regional health authorities as to the coordination of their respective activities in connection with the transfusion service, with a view to securing and maintaining an adequate supply of blood and plasma for the purposes of the health service.
What has been set out in 87 is the 1994 position, not the 1993
Indeed.
Position.
So
the footnote, no doubt, is accurate. What I think you said was in addition.
So the position in 1993 was that those provisions in bullet points and the two provisions in the footnote were in place. The provision in 1994, the two bullet points came out, the two footnotes, F and G, came out. And if we go back to paragraph 87, AA was inserted. So the bullet points remained in 93 and 94. In 94, AA was added, which makes the NBA responsible for directly for collection, screening and processing of blood and its constituents and supplying blood plasma, etc., for the purposes of the health service. So that was added in 94.
So I see. So the black bullet points on the screen were there from the beginning.
Indeed. And remained
and
there.
AA was added.
It was. And
in order to make way for AA, the provision of advice and the monitoring of the operation were removed.
Indeed. And if we go over the page, also added in 94 was H, which is the promotion by advertisement and otherwise of the giving of blood and its constituents for the purpose of the health service, with a view in particular to maintaining an adequate number of persons who are willing to give blood or its constituents for these purposes.
So previously, was it a matter for the individual regions how they advertised whether that you should come and give blood?
Indeed, it was, yes.
And it would follow what you were told about the process of donation and how it was organised?
Yes. Shamit, can we go to WITN 672006? I'm just going to WITN 067, sorry, 2006. Sure, I gave you the wrong number. Yeah, so this is a statement of Dr. Gail Mifflin on behalf of the Nbts. And if we could go, please, to page 92 of that statement, she sets out what she understands that 1994 order actually meant. She says this at paragraph 272. On 1st of April 93, the National Blood Authority, the predecessor to NHSBT, was established as an SHA, a Special Health Authority. At that time, the NBA was responsible for BPL and the International Blood Group Reference Laboratory. So that's the 93 position. On 1st April 94, the NBA then became responsible for the RTCs. I understand that from that date, the regional health authorities no longer managed the RTCs. The name of the RTCs was changed to blood centres, BCs, and referring, she said, goes on to say, paragraph 273, referring to the documents I have been provided, it would appear that the blood centres and their functions became assimilated into the National Blood Authority as a single national service. The centres increasingly were treated as parts of the whole institution rather than distinct institutions operating around the country. Now, Dr. Gunson was initially appointed as the first National Director of the National Blood Authority when it was formed in April 93, but he retired in May 94 and was replaced by Dr. Angela Robinson. And in September 94, the NBA issued a document called Proposals for the Future Blood Service, which was a consultation document, which was a synopsis of a 777-page review called the Bain Report. And that consultation proposed centralising management into a single small unit, consolidating testing facilities and putting cost-saving proposals into effect, whilst securing the future blood supply in terms of quantity and safety. And the NBA received a large number of responses to that consultation, primarily from those regions rather, where their regional transfusion centre was being considered for amalgamation with other centres. And following that consultation, the NBA created 3 administrative zones in London and the South East, in the Midlands and the South West, and the Northern Zone, with an administrative centre in each. The administrative centre was in London and the South East was North London, Midlands and the South West was Bristol, and the Northern Zone was in Leeds. And they amalgamated the Lancaster Regional now the Lancaster Regional Transfusion Centre with the Manchester one, Bristol with Plymouth, and Oxford with Birmingham. The National Blood Authority was abolished on the 1st of October 2005 and replaced by the establishment of the NHS Blood and Transplant, NHSBT, a special health authority in England and Wales. So the current position is that NHSBT is the health authority with responsibility for managing blood services in England, and I'll come on to explain why that doesn't include Wales in a moment, and it has responsibility for managing services, including transplantation services, in relation to stem cells, human tissue and human organs in the UK. I'm now going to move on to Wales. And before I start, I hope it will have been clear that much of what I said in the previous part of the presentation applied to Wales. So this is just the Welsh-specific issues that I'm dealing with here. And I should also say that there is currently less detailed information available to the inquiry about the history of Wales, of the Welsh Blood Service, but that's something that we will continue to investigate. And it may be that more information comes as a result of oral evidence. So Nbts Wales was made up of a single regional transfusion centre in Cardiff, which served the hospitals in South and Mid Wales. The regional transfusion centre in Cardiff was established in 1940, and following the establishment of the NHS in 1948, it was managed by the Welsh Regional Health Board. In 1974, Nbts Wales, effectively the Cardiff Regional Transfusion Centre, became the responsibility of the Welsh office. In 1982, responsibility was delegated by the Welsh office to the South Glamorgan District Health Authority. And in 1991, responsibility for Nbts Wales was delegated to the Welsh Health Common Services Authority. Nbts Wales did not become part of the National Blood Authority when it was formed in 1993. That was just for the regional transfusion centres in England. And this change prompted consideration as to the future management of the Welsh blood transfusion services. If we can look, please, at SCGV 5053 underscore 013. So we can see from this page here that this is a covering letter dated 14th of November 1994 to R. Ponton in NHS Scotland, and it is from a P. Davenport of the Health Services Division of the Welsh Office. And it says, future management arrangements for the National Blood Transfusion Service Wales. I promise to let you have a copy of the recommendations for future management arrangements for NTBS Wales. I think it should be NBTS. And then if we turn over, we can see the document itself. Recommendations for future management arrangements for the National Blood Transfusion Service Wales, and then the date is October 1994. And then if we turn over to page 4, we can see the contents of that report. And page 6 we can see the objective of the report. The objective of this report is to recommend the chosen option for future management arrangements for the National Blood Transfusion Service Wales, following receipt of a direction from the Secretary of State for Wales indicating that the Welsh Health Common Services Authority should cease to maintain managerial control of Nbts Wales. And it sets out what happened in 1991, that managerial control was transferred to them from South Glamorgan Health Authority. It's then probably worth looking at the vision and mission of Nbts Wales, which appears below. The vision is to be the acknowledged centre of excellence for blood transfusion and transplant immunology services in Wales. Mission, through the generosity of donors and the valued contribution of staff, to provide quality blood transfusion and transplant immunology services for the treatment of patients in Wales. If we then go on to page 8, paragraph 4.3, we can see what prompted the report: the establishment of the NBA to take over direct managerial control of the transfusion service in England from April 94, and the outcome of the Bain review into transfusion services has resulted in amalgamation of the former regional services within England into 3 zones. Managerial and support services will be centralised within each zone, and certain laboratory functions will be reorganised on a supra-regional basis, thus allowing a small number of English regional centres to be closed. This includes the Mersey Centre, and we'll come on to why that's significant in a moment. The ethos behind these changes is to achieve greater efficiency and a higher quality service. The situation in Wales should therefore seek to mirror and support these initiatives, and particularly move towards a largely cohesive United Kingdom transfusion service. If we go over the page if we go over to page 11, we can see that there are a number of shortlisted options that the report recommends at paragraph 8, section 8. The following are therefore the shortlisted options worthy of future consideration: a do minimum, brackets, Nbts Wales becomes a special health authority. B, incorporate into the NBA as a 5th transfusion centre within the South West zone. Or C, Nbts Wales as a 4th zone within the NBA. And then if we go back to page 9, we can see what do minimum means. That's paragraph 7.1. This is, if we go down to 7.1, this is taken to assume that the formation of a special health authority for Nbts Wales alone, as opposed to at present being within the managerial control of a special health authority. This option would be robust against all external influences and would maintain the unique identity of the Welsh Transfusion Service. And then missing out the next sentence, it is recognised that this option will probably best serve the need for accountability to the Secretary of State for Wales, and potentially could also lead to a cooperative coexistence with the National Blood Authority and also the Scottish and Irish transfusion services. And then if we go over the page to page 10, we can see a bit more detail at 7.4 about the option of incorporating it as the 5th transfusion centre within the South West zone. This option would embrace entirely the ideals of the NBA, although further evaluation is necessary to examine the ability to retain overall accountability to the Secretary of State for Wales. It must be recognised that all the strategic planning within the NBA has already taken place, and the zonal planning is now well advanced. The timescale for incorporation of Wales as a potential 5th centre within the South West zone, therefore, could mean that professionals within the Welsh service would have little influence regarding already decided strategy and policy. However, because this option provides the support and guidance of a larger organisation with the same overall service objectives, it is retained for further evaluation. And then over the page we see a bit more detail about the third proposal, which is Nbts Wales as a 4th zone within the NBA. This option, while embracing the ideals of the MBA, would offer on initial consideration greater opportunity for maintaining accountability to the Secretary of State for Wales and deserves further evaluation. However, the difficulties regarding strategic planning are also to be recognised, and there could be some difficulty in engrafting Wales as a fourth zone subsequent to any formation of the MBA. It's assumed that this option, despite the fact that NBTS Wales has a substantially lower annual collection volume than the equivalent English zones, would enable Wales to have similar status to an equivalent English zone. This would be reflected in the Managing Director of NBTS Wales becoming a member of the MBA Management Executive and there being a Welsh member on the MBA board. This option is therefore retained for future evaluation.
For further evaluation.
Further evaluation, sorry. And then if we go lastly on this document to page 38, we can see what the ultimate recommendation of this report was. In making a recommendation, it's recognised that option B, incorporation into the MBA as a fifth transfusion centre within the southwest zone, should be discarded on the basis of poor satisfaction of quality and financial evaluations. In examining the remaining two options, option A, do minimum, NBTSW Special Health Authority, and option C, NBTSW as fourth zone within the MBA, it's been clearly shown that option A far outweighs option C as far as satisfaction of quality criteria, there being little difference in the financial evaluations. It's therefore recommended that the option of choice based on quality criteria is do minimum. This would best serve the needs of the people of Wales in offering good stewardship of capital assets, effective service delivery and maintenance of accountability to the Secretary of State for Wales. So that was the proposal. In fact, it appears that was not taken up because the service continued to be managed within the Welsh Health Common Services Authority. So a special health authority was not, in fact, at that stage established. Now, initially, the blood transfusion service in Wales reported to the Ministry of Health, and then the Department of Health and Social Services. And then from 1965, it reported to the Welsh office. The Welsh Blood Service was formed in 1999 and reported to the Senedd. Also in 1999, responsibility for NBTS, for the Welsh Blood Service, transferred over to the Velindre NHS Trust, pursuant to the Velindre National Health Service Trust Establishment Amendment Order 1999. Now, the director of the Cardiff Regional Transfusion Centre was Dr. Napier from 1978 to 1998, and he also held the position of as part-time medical director of the Welsh Blood Service from 1999 to 2002, and we'll be hearing oral evidence from him next week. So that, sir, is the position of the Welsh Blood Service insofar as it, and so you will have noticed that I've only made mention of South and Mid Wales. The position in relation to North Wales was different. So hospitals in North Wales were served by the Regional Transfusion Centre in Liverpool, hence why it was significant that Regional Transfusion Centre was being merged in the by the MBA. That position continued to be the case after the formation of the MBA in 2003. So when there was a split between England and Wales on the 1st of April 2003 with the establishment of the National Blood Authority, the hospitals in North Wales continued to be serviced by the Liverpool Regional Transfusion Centre, so they effectively went over to the NBA and formed part of the National Blood Authority. In 2005, when NHSBT was formed as a special health authority, it was a special health authority for England and Wales because it incorporated the hospitals in North Wales, or the services for the hospital in North Wales, I should say. So the NHSBT took responsibility for those county boroughs in North Wales that had historically been served by the Liverpool Regional Transfusion Centre and had formed part of the English service. So it was not until 2016 that management of the provision of hospitals in North Wales transferred from NHSBT to the Welsh Blood Service. So it's not until 2016 that there was a unified Welsh Blood Service. It's perhaps unsurprising in those circumstances, i.e. one regional transfusion centre in Wales, and the fact that North Wales was serviced by an English regional transfusion centre, that the Welsh regional transfusion director, and for the period of time the inquiry is concerned with, that was Dr. Napier, was part of the same committees, groups and decision-making forums as the English regional transfusion directors. So we see Dr. Napier attending regional transfusion director meetings in England. We see Cardiff as being part of the western, southwestern zone of regional transfusion centres as created by Dr. Tovey. And we see Dr. Napier attending, or at least being invited to attend those meetings. And we see occasionally on minutes of meetings for advisory committees and central committee and so on, Welsh representative. But the question as to how, as to the extent to which Wales was represented on decision-making bodies and advisory forums is an issue to be explored at the hearings. So I'm now going to move on to Northern Ireland, and in common with the position in Wales, there is at present not much information available to the inquiry about the history of the Northern Irish Blood Transfusion Service. And again, that is something that we continue to investigate, and it may be that more evidence comes to light during the oral hearings. In 1948, the Northern Irish Service became the responsibility of the Northern Ireland Hospitals Authority. And in 1953, a new headquarters was established in Belfast, which later became the Belfast Regional Transfusion Centre. Also in 1953, the service started to use a mobile donation unit, which was the first of its kind in the United Kingdom. At this stage, the blood transfusion laboratories were at the Royal Victoria Hospital in Belfast. In 1961, they moved to Belfast City Hospital. And in 1970, the laboratories and the blood donor organisation were brought together in one building and amalgamated into a single organisation. In Northern Ireland, the NHS was merged with the broader social care system in 1973 and called the Health and Personal Social Services, and later the Health and Social Care System. And between 1972 and 1999, the health system of Northern Ireland was managed by the UK government via the Northern Ireland Office. So until 1999, public and social policy decisions appear to have been taken at Westminster and communicated through the Secretary of State within the Northern Ireland Office who answered directly to the UK government. During this period of direct rule, so up in 1972 to 1999, it appears that the default position in terms of reform and the development of policy and strategy in health and social services was to mirror English policy decisions. During this time, the service came under the remit of the Eastern Health and Social Services Board. On the 1st of June 1994, a special agency came into, it was established. A special health and social care agency was established. The Personal Social Services Special Agencies Northern Ireland Order enabled the establishment. Sorry, I've got that rather muddled. Let me start that again. On the 1st of June 1994, an order came into operation which enabled the establishment of a special health and social care agency to which the Department of Health and Social Services could delegate its functions. Also, on the 1st of June 1994, the Northern Ireland Blood Transfusion Service Special Agency was established as a special health and social care agency pursuant to the order that allowed such agencies to be established. On the same date, directions came into force which set out what the functions of the Northern Ireland Blood Transfusion Service were, and they were those directions required it to ensure that all hospitals and other clinical units in Northern Ireland are provided with adequate supplies of blood and blood products. In 1995, the Northern Ireland Blood Transfusion Service moved to a purpose-built facility on the City Hospital site in Belfast, and this remains their headquarters. The service had one regional transfusion centre in Belfast. The first director of the service between 1969 and 1980 was Colonel T.E. Field, followed from June 1980 to May 1994 by Dr. Maurice McClelland, who was also the Regional Transfusion Director of the Belfast Regional Transfusion Centre. From June 1994 and the creation of the Northern Ireland Blood Transfusion Service, Dr. Maurice McClelland's title became that of Chief Executive and Medical Director, and he stepped down in 2009.
So he served for 29 years from 1980?
Yes. We can see from the minutes of the meetings that we have that a representative of the Northern Ireland Blood Transfusion Service attended English and Welsh Regional Transfusion Director meetings from the 1960s through to 1989 when the meetings were abolished. We can also see that Dr. Maurice McClelland was invited to attend the Scottish National Blood Transfusion Directors meetings and the coordinating group meetings from the end of 1982. And we can also see that the Northern Ireland office, via a representative of the Department of Health and Social Services Northern Ireland, attended meetings of the Advisory Committee of the National Blood Transfusion Service. Again, the extent to which there was representation in decision-making forums for the Northern Ireland Blood Transfusion Service is something we will explore in the forthcoming hearings. It's just worth noting before leaving Northern Ireland that the service had its plasma fractionated by BPL but in the early 1980s, it appears that it began sending its plasma to Scotland for fractionation at PFC.
Now, the early 1980s can cover a wide variety of years,
It can.
some of which are of great significance in this inquiry. When?
My recollection is it's 1982 to about 1982, 1983. Let me just check that that is correct. My recollection of that is correct. Perhaps, sir, I can get back to you on the specific date.
And it may be a slowly developing process over a period of time, I appreciate, but it would be useful to know when it started and when effectively it became the complete picture.
Yes. So then I come last, but not least, of course, to Scotland. So Scotland originally had a walking blood donor panel established in Edinburgh by a Mr. Jack Copland at the Edinburgh Royal Infirmary. There were initially 12 volunteers on the panel, and they would be collected and taken to the patient when blood was required.
So when they're described as a walking, they are collected?
That's what I understand. Once it looked like there was going to be an outbreak of war, the Second World War, the Department of Health set up a transfusion subcommittee, and this recommended that stores of blood should be made available in various centres. So by the beginning of World War II, there were blood banks at the Royal Infirmary in Edinburgh and at Stobhill Hospital in Glasgow. In 1940, the Scottish National Blood Transfusion Association, a charitable body, was formed to run the blood transfusion service. And at this stage, the Scottish Blood Transfusion Service consisted of 5 regional blood transfusion centres. In Edinburgh, the Edinburgh Regional Transfusion Centre served Edinburgh and the southeast of Scotland. There was a centre in Glasgow that served Glasgow in the west of Scotland, a centre in Dundee that served Dundee and the east of Scotland, in Aberdeen served Aberdeen and the northeast Scotland, and in Inverness, serving Inverness and North Scotland. Each transfusion centre had a transfusion director, and in addition, there was from the beginning a national organiser. Initially, this was Mr. Copland. By 1944, the centres combined had 57,000 donors. And in 1948, of course, we know that the National Health Service was created. And at that stage, the blood service became the responsibility of the Secretary of State for Scotland. So whereas the position in England was that on the establishment of the National Health Service, that was devolved to the regions, in Scotland it remained with central government, the responsibility. The Scottish National Blood Transfusion Association continued as a charitable body which managed the blood service through its executive committee, but the Secretary of State for Scotland took over all its premises, equipment and staff.
So can I just understand that? What did taking over its premises, equipment and staff consist of? And where were the lines drawn between that and management, which you say remained with the charity? Isn't it clear?
It's not clear to me, and it may be that it's something that we can explore as we go through the hearings. But when one looks at the meeting minutes, it's clear that regional transfusion centre directors are having to make bids for improvements to accommodation, for equipment and so on to central government, and so it seems that the funding was with central government, but quite what the role of the NBTA was in terms of management is not clear to me at the moment.
So, in addition to premises, equipment, and staff, one could add financing or funding.
Yes, that's my current understanding, but I suspect that more will become clear as we progress through the hearings.
Well, it might. I mean, if it's a charity, then it may very well have drawn its money from other sources.
Yes, and we see as well that it survives various. It effectively ends up as a donor organisation, the SNBTA, surviving changes to the structure of the service. Can we look at PRSE 301217? So this is a circular dated the 3rd of November 1972, entitled Health Service Reorganisation Scotland, and it was a circular issued by the Scottish Home and Health Department. We can see that on page 5 at the bottom there, Scottish Home and Health Department. And then if we go back, please, to the first page, we can see it's entitled Sir, Common Services Agency, Introduction. This circular indicates the likely form and function of the Common Services Agency and describes the intended initial steps towards setting it up. So this was issued by the Scottish Home and Health Department, and we can see what the purpose of the CSA was. If we go to page 2, paragraph 5, the CSA's prime role will be to act as an agent for the health boards in providing them with important supporting services of a kind likely to be best organised centrally. The broad policies and questions of broad resource allocations in respect of these services will be decided by the Secretary of State on the advice of the Planning Council as appropriate, in the light of the needs of the Health Board and of the Department for the services being funded for them. And then if we go to Annex A, which we find at page 6, we see proposed functions of the Common Service Agency. And if we go down to A, services, we can see at little 3 that it little 4 rather, it includes blood transfusion services. So the proposal is for the creation of this Common Service Agency to which the functions of the blood service would be transferred. And we can see the central organisation. If we go back to page 2, the central organisation, the structure of the CSA at paragraph 6, the CSA will be operating a range of disparate services, and this fact will determine its basic organisation. The main responsibility for the day-to-day running of each service within the allocated expenditure and in accordance with broad policies will fall to the chief officer or director of that division of the CSA, and he will in most cases be directly responsible to the management committee or to any subcommittee which may be set up for the particular service. And then if we go over the page to paragraph 11, under policies, sorry, did I say, yes, policies, page 3, paragraph 11, it's envisaged that the broad policies within which most divisions of the CSA will work will have been laid down by the Secretary of State, having regard to the needs and priorities of those for whom the service is provided, and to any advice from the Planning Council. Each division will operate within its predetermined budget, expressed as an earmarked allocation by the department to the CSA in the light of estimated estimates submitted annually through the Management Committee. So the proposal is for a very much centralised structure, centrally funded, centrally managed, of the blood services within this common service agency. On issue of this circular, there was some significant concern on the part of the regional transfusion directors about the plan, the transfusion directors about the plan. Their concerns were not only that there was no detail about precisely how the transfer was going to work, but also that it would be an overly bureaucratic structure. And so they set out their views in a number of documents, but I'm just going to look at one of those. It's at PRSE 304463. It's a letter written to N.A. Milne on secretary in Edinburgh, and if we go to the second page of the document, we can see it's signed by a number of regional transfusion centre directors, including Director Dr. John Cash, who was the director of Edinburgh at the time, and Mr. John Watt, who was the first scientific director of PFC. And if we go back to the first page, we can see that the subject of the letter is Health Service Reorganisation Scotland, the blood transfusion service. And it starts, following a meeting of the regional directors and the scientific director of the Protein Fractionation Centre, held in the Regional Blood Transfusion Centre at Edinburgh on the 9th of January 1974, I have been requested to convey to you their unanimous opinion and constructive suggestions regarding the future arrangements for the management of the blood transfusion service in Scotland. They desire to express their alarm and deep concern that the Scottish National Blood Transfusion Association has indicated its intention to transfer its responsibilities to the Common Service Agency on the April 1st, 1974, solely as it appears to the directors, on the basis of Circular HSR 73C40, which is a circular we just looked at. They wish to convey in the strongest possible terms that they consider the proposals for the transfer of these responsibilities, as set out in the circular, to be totally inadequate as a basis on which to judge whether the immediate and future commitments to the health service can be effectively discharged. In view of the imminent changes in the scope and function of the blood transfusion service, it is their considered opinion that the lack of detail not only renders the document unacceptable as a formula for their transfer to the Common Services Agency, but also calls into question the choice of this agency as the organisation best suited to undertake the management of the blood transfusion service in Scotland. In particular, it is stressed that far-reaching changes in the clinical, scientific, technical and organisational spheres of blood transfusion practice have emerged since the present proposals were first considered. They appreciate that detailed information about the intention, if we go over the page, about the intention of the Common Services Agency may not be available to either the Scottish National Blood Transfusion Association or the Scottish Home and Health Department representatives. If this is so, it reinforces the need to delay implementation of the circular. As the professional group directly responsible for the operation of the blood transfusion services in Scotland, they therefore consider it their duty to make the following proposals. That arrangements for the transfer of responsibility for the blood transfusion service to the Common Services Agency be held in abeyance in order to allow full and urgent discussions to take place between the medical and scientific directors, the Scottish National Blood Transfusion Association, the Central Consultative Committee and senior representatives of the Scottish Home and Health Department. That the Scottish National Blood Transfusion Association be asked to continue in office in its present form with the addition of the National Medical Director and the Administrative Officer with supporting staff until such time as an acceptable solution for the effective management of the blood transfusion service in Scotland has been agreed. So despite this request, despite the request from the transfusion directors, in April 1974, the blood service was reorganised and placed administratively within the newly formed Common Service Agency of the Scottish Scottish Health Service, in a division of the CSA called Scottish National Blood, the Scottish National Blood Transfusion Service. The CSA was overseen by the Scottish Home and Health Department and its successors, namely the Scottish Executive Health Department and the Scottish Government Health Department. The Scottish Home and Health Department and its successors were administered prior to devolution by the Scottish Office, Department of the Secretary of State for Scotland, and since devolution in 1999, the Common Service Agency has been administered through the relevant minister, currently called the Minister of Health and Social Care, who is answerable to the Scottish Parliament. The functions of the CSA were initially set out in the National Health Service Functions of the Common Service Agency Scotland Order of 1974, and required the CSA to supply human blood for the purposes of carrying out blood transfusion and related services, including the production of blood fractions. Its functions also included the donor services previously administered by the SNBTA, which continued as a charitable body to represent blood donors. So I think, sir, in answer to your question, I think that may be the answer to the question. The SNBTA was concerned with donor services, and the transfer of the equipment, personnel and accommodation was in relation to the other services of the blood service. In October 1976, the transfusion directors sent the Scottish Home and Health Department a paper setting out their views on the future of the blood transfusion service, and we can see that at PRSE 301535. We can see the covering letter is to the Scottish Home and Health Department, Dr. McIntyre, and it says, you will remember the discussion at the BTS directors meeting on 1st July, at which it was agreed that a paper concerning medical staffing and the future of blood transfusion should be submitted to you. And then the middle of the next paragraph, I am accordingly enclosing a draft discussion paper on future management of BTS, which has been agreed by all BTS directors. And then we get to the paper itself on page 2, and it's called Future Management of the Blood Transfusion Service in Scotland. Paragraph 1, this paper sets out as a basis for discussion the consensus view of Scottish transfusion directors of the future management of the blood transfusion service in Scotland. Paragraph 4, the position in 1976. The anxiety expressed during these meetings has been realised, and it is referring to the anxiety expressed by the directors as it's gone over the history of the development of the CSA. The Management Committee does not have within or available to it such independent specialist and other advice as was available within its predecessor, the Executive Committee of the SNBTA. This lack of professional expertise and clinical user involvement is considered by the transfusion directors to be a retrograde step in the management of the service. For some years before 1974, it had been planned that a small BTS headquarters should take over the duties of the part-time officers of SNBTA and the medical secretary and administrative officer provided by SHHD. In the event, the headquarters was not established until early 1974, at the time of transfer to CSA, when a CSA headquarters office was also established, apparently to undertake, on behalf of CSA divisions, duties hitherto carried out within the divisions themselves. The resultant duplication of effort, made worse by the recruitment of inexperienced staff to CSA headquarters, has been expensive, unrewarding to all concerned, and detrimental to effective management. The transfusion directors are now in no doubt that the appropriate place for BTS central administration is in its own headquarters, aided by financial and management accounting and internal audit. This arrangement will be cost-effective. Interposing CSA headquarters as a tier between the directors of CSA divisions and the management committee of which they are accountable has been most unfortunate. And then it goes on at paragraph 6 over the page, after the quote there. After 2.5 years' experience and following careful consideration, it is the view of the transfusion directors that BTS should be administered as a national service and that its nature renders it unsuited to management by a committee composed entirely of health board members and officers and officials of SHHD within the framework of CSA. And then the proposal that's made for the future is set out at paragraph 7. It is suggested that the service should transfer to a management committee responsible to the Secretary of State and having the following membership: chairman appointed by Secretary of State, Transfusion Service National Medical Director, transfusion directors, donor interest, user interest, health board interest, and observers from the Home and Health Department, medical, executive and finance. And the secretary to the committee would be the national administrator of the blood transfusion service. The committee would assume the executive authority presently exercised by the CSA Management Committee, and there would be no further need for the present coordinating group of transfusion directors. The directors' professional meetings are, however, essential and should continue. It's hoped that the Secretary of State will continue to receive advice from the Blood Transfusion Advisory Group to the Planning Council. The response to this we can see at PRSE 302319. It's dated the 2nd of December 1976 to Miss Corrie, who sent the paper we've just looked at, and it's the second paragraph. The paper, which is the paper we've just looked at, is being circulated within the department, and I am not yet in a position to send you any formal reply. It's only fair to say, however, that the SMPTS is now formally a part of the NHS and therefore can therefore only be administered in the existing health service framework, and goes on to say that that's been made clear to the directors on a number of occasions. Undeterred by this, the directors continue to press their point that the current structure is expensive and, frankly, in their view, doesn't work. And an agreement is reached in June 1977, and we can see that recorded in a document at PRSE 40108. This is a minute of a special meeting of the Management Committee of the Common Service Agency held on the 26th of April 1978. And if we go down to the bottom of this page, at 68.1, matters arising from these minutes, minute 6481, management arrangements in the blood transfusion service. There was submitted the report of the ad hoc committee on management arrangements in the blood transfusion service. Presenting the report, the chairman recalled that in 1977, the blood transfusion centre service regional directors had asked to meet the Secretary of State to express their concern at management arrangements in the blood transfusion service. The management committee, at their meeting on 15 June 77, had agreed to establish an ad hoc committee with the remit to examine and report to the management committee on the management arrangements for the blood transfusion service within the Common Service Agency. It was now urgent that the management arrangements for the blood transfusion service be resolved, and he had therefore called a special meeting of the management committee to consider the report of the ad hoc committee. A letter had been received from Dr. J.D. Cash on behalf of all the regional directors of the blood transfusion service, confirming that they accepted the recommendations of the ad hoc committee the chairman expressed his appreciation. And we can see over the page what that looks like. After a full and frank discussion, the Management Committee accepted the recommendations of the Ad Hoc Committee on Management Arrangements in the Blood Transfusion Service and agreed, 1, to establish a subcommittee of the Management Committee, specifically to deal with matters relating to the Blood Transfusion Service, to be known as the Blood Transfusion Service Subcommittee, that the Blood Transfusion Subcommittee should have the terms of reference set out in Appendix 1, and we can see that at page 5 of this document. There shall stand, referred to the Blood Transfusion Service Subcommittee, the review of the operational activity of the Blood Transfusion Service to ensure that the services provided are efficient and economic and within approved financial allocations, formulation of proposals for the development and improvement of the service, liaison with, paragraph 3, liaison with other authorities on developments in the service, paragraph 4, review of complaints, paragraph 5, control of the establishment of staff within the service and the appointment and dismissal of staff, paragraph 6, the application to staff in the to staff of nationally approved terms and conditions of service. Para 8, provision of medical and operational equipment required. And Capital 9, preparation of a capital programme. And 10, appointment of such ad hoc advisory committees and working parties as may be necessary to advise on specific matters relating to the service provided by the Blood Transfusion Service. So those are the terms of reference of the subcommittee. And then if we go back to page 2, and it sets out the constitution of the blood service subcommittee at subparagraph 3 there. 6 members of the management committee, 1 who'd be convener, including the chairman and vice chairman, in ex officio members in terms of the standing orders of the agency, 2 specialists in clinical medicine, 2 specialists in laboratory medicine, 1 medical officer from the Scottish Home and Health Department, 1 representative of donor interest. And then we see at 5 that the National Medical Director should, as a matter of course, receive the agenda and supporting papers for each meeting of the Blood Transfusion Service Subcommittee and attend or be represented. And, over the page, that the other directors within the Blood Transfusion Service should also receive copies of the agenda and supporting papers of each meeting and, subject to the agreement of the convener, attend if they so wished. So that was the agreement that was reached in June 1977. And so what then happened was that subcommittee in turn set up a working party in which representatives of the in which the transfusion directors participated. There were further legislative changes in 1978, which had the effect of reconstituting the CSA. And so members of the management committee of the CSA were appointed by the Secretary of State. And that structure remained largely unchanged following the appointment of Professor Cash in 1978 as the National Medical Director. And again, the extent to which the regional services retained autonomy through the period will be an issue that we will, the extent to which the individual blood transfusion centres retained autonomy through this period will be explored within the hearings. We can see from the minutes that are available to us that through the late 1970s and 1980s, the Scottish National Blood Transfusion Service Coordinating Group met on a regular basis, as did the Nbts directors. I've already mentioned when I was doing the presentation on England that the first formal liaison, if you like, between Scotland and England and Wales came when the advisory committee to the National Blood Transfusion Service in England was formed in December 1980, and there was part of the remit was to advise the Department of Health and Social Security on coordination of the English and Welsh and Scottish blood transfusion services. The first joint committee between the Scottish and the English services was the formation of the SNBTS Nbts Liaison Committee in June 1990. We can also see from the minutes that there was regular attendance by Professor Cash at regional transfusion director meetings in England, that Dr. Cash attended the advisory committee on the Nbts formed in December 1980, although that committee was dealing only with matters concerning England and Wales. And there was often an English director or a representative of the National Directorate, once that had been formed, at Scottish Regional Transfusion Director meetings. In 1990, the Scottish National Blood Transfusion Service created a general manager position, and that position was then renamed National Director in 1996. And the National Medical Director, who was Professor Cash, became the National Medical and Scientific Director. So the regional directors and the PFC director became managerially accountable to the general manager, who then became known as the National Director, and professionally accountable to the National Medical and Scientific Director. The SNBTS Management Board at that stage comprised the General Manager, the National Medical and Scientific Director, the 5 Transfusion Centre Directors, the Director of PFC, a National Donor Services Manager, Director of Human Resources, a Director of Finance and a Director of Quality. And following a strategic review in 1998, 1999, SNBTS was restructured to move away from regional structure towards a national structure. And since that time, all blood donor services have been managed nationally. A Director of Operations was created to manage donor services, manufacturing and logistics, and the number of blood processing and testing units was reduced to 2. A National Quality Directorate was formed along with other national support services, and hospital blood banking and related clinical and laboratory functions remained distributed within the regional transfusion centres, and the regional transfusion directors became clinical directors. In 2002 to 2003, the Common Services Agency underwent a strategic review, and once again, the clinical directors of Scottish National Blood Transfusion Service expressed their dissatisfaction with the CSA as being not qualified to manage the performance of the SNBTS, and a report that was authored at that time concluded that there was some justification for those concerns because of the lack of a developed system of clinical governance in the CSA, and a lack of clarity about the role and purpose of the board, and a lack of clarity about how the CSA and its divisions add value to each other's activities. And following that review, the governance arrangements were strengthened. The SNBTS National Director became an executive director of the CSA board, and the CSA board adopted the governance structure of other health boards, including a clinical governance committee, and the centralisation of some of its support services. On the 1st of October 2008, the National Health Service Functions of the Common Services Agency Scotland order removed the production of blood fractions from the functions of the CSA. The CSA remained responsible for the provision of supplies of human blood for transfusion and related services. And there was a period of wider organisational structural change in 2012-2013, resulting in consolidation of a number of CSA divisions, often called strategic business units, and the centralisation of support services. But the SNBTS was considered of sufficient size and speciality to retain its own identity. In 2013, there were changes to the name. The SNBTS board was renamed Senior Management Group and was chaired by the SNBTS National Director. The Medical and Scientific Committee was renamed the Clinical Governance and Safety Group, and the posts of clinical directors were removed, and SNBTS was organised into a number of national directorates led by associate directors, and those were donor and transport services, blood manufacturing, patient services, and strategy, planning and performance. And there's been no significant further change to structure since that time. It appears from the documentation that the inquiry has that the SNBTS was funded centrally from the Scottish Government's central budget rather than from regional health budgets, as was the case in England and Wales. That until 2002-2003, the Scottish Home and Health Department provided the CSA with a ring-fence budget for the for the blood service. But after this time, there was no ring-fence budget, so it was left to the CSA to allocate a budget to the SNBTS as part of its internal business planning. So that brings me to the end of the presentation on the history and structure of the blood transfusion services. The presentation is supported by a written presentation which has been disclosed to core participants through their legal representatives and will be made available on the website, and that has more detail and references to other documents that, for reasons of time, I haven't been able to go to.
Yes, well, thank you very much. So that concludes, just before 1 o'clock, the first part of today's business.
Thank you.
So we'll meet again at 2 o'clock. And then it's Miss Fraser Butlin, is it? We'll hear from at that stage.
Yes.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you.